Sit back, relax, and welcome to Reading Hours. Today's book is The Civil War by Ken. Please let us know in the comments from where you are watching or if there is a book you want us to summarize in future. Welcome to Reading Hours, where we delve deep into the stories that shaped our world. Today, we embark on an epic journey back in time to one of the most pivotal and tumultuous periods in American history, the Civil War. Our guide for this exploration is the seminal work by Ken Burns, The Civil War. More than just a documentary series, Burns's The Civil War is a cultural phenomenon, a meticulously crafted narrative that breathes life into faded photographs, forgotten letters, and the echoes of a conflict that tore a nation apart and ultimately forged a new one. Released in 1990, this 9-part series captivated audiences with its innovative blend of archival imagery, period music, and evocative narration, setting a new standard for historical storytelling. Its significance lies not only in its comprehensive portrayal of the war, from the simmering tensions that led to secession to the bloody battlefields and the painful process of reconstruction, but also in its profound humanistic approach. Burns doesn't just chronicle battles and political maneuvering. He brings to the forefront the experiences of ordinary soldiers, enslaved people, women on the home front, and the leaders grappling with impossible choices. The series skillfully weaves together personal anecdotes with grand historical narratives, making the distant past feel intimately present. The Civil War illuminated the moral complexities of slavery, the deep divisions that rent the nation, and the enduring legacy of a war that claimed more American lives than all other wars combined. It explored themes of freedom, sacrifice, states' rights, and the very definition of American identity. While largely lauded, the series has also sparked academic discussions and some debate over its interpretations and emphasis, particularly regarding the portrayal of certain figures or the weight given to specific aspects of the conflict. Regardless, its impact on how Americans understand their Civil War is undeniable. It's a work that continues to resonate, prompting us to reflect on the nature of conflict, the pursuit of justice, and the resilience of the human spirit. Now, let us journey into the heart of this extraordinary narrative as we begin our detailed summary of Ken Burns's The Civil War. The narrative of Ken Burns's The Civil War opens with the palpable tension of a nation teetering on the precipice of disunion, setting the stage for a conflict whose roots stretched back generations. Deeply embedded in the economic, social, and moral fabric of American society. The year is 1861, and the long, simmering dispute over slavery has finally reached a boiling point, no longer confined to the halls of Congress or the pages of abolitionist newspapers. The election of Abraham Lincoln, a Republican committed to preventing the expansion of slavery, served as the final catalyst, a signal to the Southern states that their way of life, built upon the institution of human bondage, was fundamentally threatened. South Carolina, a state long at the forefront of secessionist sentiment, was the first to act, withdrawing from the Union in December 1860, followed swiftly by 6 other states: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, which together formed the Confederate States of America in February 1861, adopting a constitution remarkably similar to the United States Constitution, but explicitly safeguarding slavery. Jefferson Davis, a former U.S. Senator and Secretary of War, was elected as their provisional president, embodying the Southern aristocracy and its commitment to states' rights and agrarian ideals. The North, still reeling from the shock of secession, found itself grappling with an unprecedented crisis. President Buchanan, in the final months of his term, largely prevaricated, leaving the daunting task of navigating this fractured nation to his successor, Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln, a man of humble origins but immense moral conviction, faced an almost impossible task to preserve the Union without alienating the remaining slave states that had not yet seceded, and to do so while the Confederacy actively asserted its independence. The air was thick with rhetoric, fervent belief on both sides in the righteousness of their cause. Southerners spoke of self-determination, of defending their homes and liberties against perceived Northern aggression, equating their struggle with the American Revolution. Northerners, particularly abolitionists, increasingly viewed the conflict through a moral lens, seeing it as a divine struggle against the sin of slavery, while many others, including Lincoln, focused primarily on the preservation of the Union as a sacred trust, a testament to the experiment in democratic governance. The narrative vividly brings to life the stark contrasts between the two emerging entities. The North, with its burgeoning industrial base, vast population, and extensive railroad networks, seemed to possess an insurmountable advantage in terms of material resources. Its factories churned out goods, its farms produced abundant food, and its cities swelled with immigrants, providing a ready supply of manpower. The South, by contrast, remained largely agrarian, its economy inextricably linked to cotton and slave labor. While it lacked the industrial might of the North, it possessed a deep-rooted military tradition, a population accustomed to outdoor life and horsemanship, and the strategic advantage of fighting on its own territory, defending its homeland. Many believed, perhaps naively, that the war would be short, a swift resolution to a long-standing dispute. There was an almost festive air in the early days, with young men on both sides eagerly enlisting, driven by patriotism, adventure, and a desire to prove their valor. They believed they would be home by Christmas, little realizing the brutal, protracted conflict that lay ahead, a war that would redefine not only the nation but also the very nature of modern warfare. The first shots of the war shattered any lingering illusions of a peaceful resolution. On April 12, 1861, Confederate batteries opened fire on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, a federal outpost whose continued presence within Confederate territory was seen as an affront to Southern sovereignty. The bombardment, a strategic move by the Confederacy to assert its independence, forced the fort's surrender after a 34-hour bombardment, mercifully without any fatalities directly from the shelling. This act of aggression, however, served as the ultimate provocation, galvanizing public opinion in the North and prompting Lincoln to issue a call for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. This call, in turn, pushed 4 more slave states, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee, to secede and join the Confederacy, unable to countenance fighting against their Southern brethren. The loss of Virginia, a state rich in history, resources, and military talent, was a particularly bitter blow to the Union, especially as its capital, Richmond, became the new capital of the Confederacy, just 100 miles from Washington, D.C. The border states of Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri, though slaveholding, remained in the Union, albeit precariously, their loyalty often divided and their territories becoming battlegrounds throughout the war. As the opposing armies began to coalesce, the immediate focus shifted to the strategic importance of the capitals. Both sides recognized that the capture of the enemy's capital would be a significant psychological and strategic victory. The Union, under the command of General Irvin McDowell, launched its first major offensive in July 1861, aiming to capture Richmond. This offensive led to the First Battle of Bull Run, or First Manassas, near Manassas, Virginia. The battle was a chaotic and bloody affair, a rude awakening for both sides to the grim realities of modern combat. What started as a relatively uncoordinated Union advance quickly devolved into a disorganized rout as Confederate forces, bolstered by reinforcements and led by figures like Thomas Stonewall Jackson, held their ground with remarkable tenacity. The sight of panicked Union soldiers fleeing back towards Washington, D.C., intermingled with curious spectators who had come out to picnic and watch the battle, became an enduring symbol of the early war's naivete and the brutal efficiency with which it disabused both sides of their romantic notions of glory. The Confederate victory, while boosting Southern morale, also instilled a sense of overconfidence, leading some to believe the war was already won. For the North, Bull Run was a sobering defeat, exposing the weaknesses in their military organization and the need for more disciplined and experienced leadership. Lincoln, recognizing the immense challenge ahead, began the arduous task of building a professional army, a task he entrusted to the dynamic but often cautious Major General George B. McClellan, who quickly earned the moniker Young Napoleon. The first year of the war, as portrayed in Burns's work, is a period of raw initiation, of a nation grappling with its own internal divisions, and of the first tentative, yet ultimately devastating, steps onto the battlefield where the future of the United States would be irrevocably shaped. The profound human cost, the shattered innocence, and the dawning realization of the magnitude of the conflict are all powerfully conveyed, setting the stage for the protracted and bloody years that would follow. The aftermath of First Bull Run plunged the Union into a period of deep introspection and strategic reevaluation, while in the Confederacy, a surge of confidence masked the immense logistical challenges that lay ahead. For the North, the defeat at Manassas was a stark and humiliating lesson. It became abundantly clear that this would not be a short, decisive war, but rather a drawn-out struggle demanding immense resources, unwavering commitment, and, most crucially, professional military leadership. President Lincoln, demonstrating remarkable foresight and determination, recognized the immediate need to transform a disparate collection of volunteer regiments into a cohesive, formidable fighting force. He placed his hopes and the fate of the Union squarely on the shoulders of Major General George B. McClellan. McClellan, a brilliant organizer and meticulous planner, rapidly set about the task of training, equipping, and drilling the Army of the Potomac, forging it into what would become the largest and most well-prepared Union Army. His efforts were prodigious. He instilled discipline, improved logistics, and boosted morale, transforming a collection of raw recruits into a professional military machine. However, McClellan's undeniable strengths as an organizer were often counterbalanced by a crippling cautiousness and an almost pathological reluctance to commit his meticulously prepared army to battle. His constant demands for more men, more supplies, and more time for preparation frequently exasperated Lincoln, who understood the imperative of decisive action. This tension between McClellan's methodical approach and Lincoln's desire for offensive operations would become a recurring theme, often hindering Union progress in the early years of the war. While McClellan was busy drilling his vast army in the East, the war in the West was beginning to take a different, more dynamic turn. Here, a relatively unknown Union general named Ulysses S. Grant began to emerge as a figure of quiet determination and strategic brilliance. Grant, who had a checkered pre-war career and a reputation for hard drinking, proved to be a decisive and relentless commander. In February 1862, he launched a series of bold offensives along the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, targeting Confederate forts Henry and Donelson. These campaigns were crucial. Fort Henry, a relatively weak earthwork, fell quickly. However, Fort Donelson, a more formidable position, proved to be a tougher nut to crack. Grant's forces besieged the fort, and when the Confederate commanders sought terms of surrender, Grant famously replied, "No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works." This uncompromising stance earned him the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant and a major victory. The fall of Fort Donelson, followed by the capture of Nashville, Tennessee, represented the first significant Union victories of the war, opening up critical river pathways deep into the Confederacy and significantly boosting Northern morale. Grant's success stood in stark contrast to the stagnation in the East, solidifying his reputation as a general who understood the importance of aggressive action and the relentless pursuit of the enemy. The spring of 1862 brought the first major Union offensive in the East, McClellan's long-awaited Peninsula Campaign. Instead of directly attacking the Confederate forces defending Richmond from the north, McClellan chose an amphibious approach, transporting his vast army by ship down the Chesapeake Bay to the Virginia Peninsula, aiming to march on the Confederate capital from the southeast. It was a logistical marvel, moving over 100,000 men, thousands of horses, and vast amounts of equipment. However, the campaign was plagued by McClellan's characteristic overcaution and his tendency to overestimate enemy strength. He consistently believed he was outnumbered, even when he held a significant numerical advantage. The Confederates, under the shrewd command of General Joseph E. Johnston, initially conducted a masterful defensive campaign, slowing McClellan's advance and forcing him into a series of costly sieges rather than decisive engagements. The campaign culminated in the 7 days' battles, a series of fierce engagements in late June and early July. After Johnston was wounded, command of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia passed to Robert E. Lee, a decision that would prove to be one of the most consequential of the entire war. Lee, a brilliant and audacious commander, immediately went on the offensive, launching a series of aggressive attacks against McClellan's exposed flanks. Despite suffering heavy casualties, Lee's aggressive tactics, combined with McClellan's continued caution and his decision to retreat to the safety of Harrison's landing on the James River, ultimately forced the Union Army to abandon its drive on Richmond. The Peninsula Campaign, despite its initial promise and the immense resources invested, ended in failure for the Union, a bitter disappointment for Lincoln and the Northern public, and a significant boost to Confederate morale. It highlighted the challenges of capturing the Confederate capital and reinforced the perception of McClellan's reluctance to engage in decisive battle. Meanwhile, in the West, another colossal and bloody engagement unfolded, further demonstrating the ferocity of the war. In April 1862, Grant's forces, having advanced deep into Tennessee, found themselves encamped near Shiloh Church, awaiting reinforcements. Unbeknownst to them, a large Confederate army under Generals Albert Sidney Johnston and P.G.T. Beauregard launched a surprise attack at dawn. The Battle of Shiloh was one of the deadliest battles of the war up to that point, a brutal 2-day struggle characterized by intense fighting and heavy casualties on both sides. The initial Confederate assault caught the Union Army off guard, driving them back and threatening to shatter their lines. However, Grant, despite the chaos and the immense pressure, refused to retreat, famously stating he intended to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer. With the arrival of reinforcements under General Don Carlos Buell on the second day, the Union forces counterattacked, eventually forcing the Confederates to withdraw. The battle was a Union victory, but at a tremendous cost, with over 23,000 casualties combined. The sheer scale of the carnage at Shiloh shocked the nation, North and South, dispelling any remaining illusions about the romanticism of war and laying bare the horrifying reality of industrial-scale slaughter. It also cemented Grant's reputation as a general who, despite setbacks, possessed an unshakable will to win and was willing to accept heavy casualties to achieve victory, a quality that would prove both controversial and ultimately essential for the Union's success. The early months of 1862, therefore, were a period of mixed fortunes. While the West saw crucial Union advances under Grant, the East remained a source of frustration due to McClellan's perceived indecisiveness. The sheer scale of the battles and the mounting casualties signaled that the war would be a long, brutal, and transformative ordeal, far exceeding anyone's initial expectations. Following the strategic setbacks of the Peninsula Campaign and the staggering casualties at Shiloh, the summer of 1862 saw a marked shift in the strategic landscape and a growing sense of desperation on both sides. For the Union, the frustration with McClellan's cautiousness reached a fever pitch. Lincoln, increasingly exasperated by his generals' endless preparations and reluctance to engage, replaced him in overall command with Henry Halleck, though McClellan retained command of the Army of the Potomac. The political pressure for a decisive victory was immense, and the public's initial enthusiasm for the war was beginning to wane in the face of mounting casualties and no clear end in sight. Meanwhile, Robert E. Lee, now firmly in command of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, seized the initiative. Having successfully repelled McClellan's advance on Richmond, Lee, ever the audacious strategist, decided to carry the war into Union territory, believing that a successful invasion of Maryland might achieve several critical objectives: relieve pressure on Virginia, provision his army from northern farms, encourage Maryland to join the Confederacy, and most importantly, potentially influence the upcoming congressional elections in the North, perhaps even garnering foreign recognition and aid for the Confederacy from Great Britain and France. This bold move led to the Maryland Campaign, a gamble that risked everything for the Confederacy. Lee's invasion of Maryland, however, was not without its immediate complications. A copy of his Special Order 191, outlining his troop dispositions and plans, was famously discovered by Union soldiers wrapped around 3 cigars. This intelligence windfall, known as Lee's Lost Order, gave McClellan an unprecedented opportunity to anticipate Lee's movements and potentially crush the divided Confederate Army. Despite this incredible advantage, McClellan's characteristic caution again came into play as he moved slowly, failing to capitalize fully on the intelligence. This hesitancy allowed Lee precious time to consolidate his forces and prepare for a major engagement. The climax of the Maryland Campaign came on September 17, 1862, with the Battle of Antietam near Sharpsburg, Maryland. It remains the single bloodiest day in American military history, a horrifying testament to the destructive power of modern weaponry and the desperate courage of the soldiers on both sides. The battle was fought across 3 main phases: the cornfield, the sunken road Bloody Lane, and Burnside's bridge, each witnessing brutal, close-quarters combat and massive casualties. Wave after wave of Union assaults, though uncoordinated, ground down the Confederate lines. Despite being heavily outnumbered, Lee's veterans fought with incredible tenacity, holding their ground against overwhelming odds. By the end of the day, an estimated 23,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. The sheer scale of the slaughter was unprecedented, forever etching Antietam into the national consciousness as a symbol of the war's unmitigated horror. Tactically, Antietam was a draw, but strategically, it was a crucial Union victory. Lee's invasion of Maryland was repulsed, and his battered army was forced to retreat back into Virginia. Crucially, The outcome of Antietam provided President Lincoln with the moral and military leverage he desperately needed to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. For months, Lincoln had been contemplating a bolder move against slavery, recognizing its fundamental role in sustaining the Confederate war effort. He understood that striking at slavery would not only cripple the South's economy, but also transform the war from a struggle solely for Union preservation into a moral crusade for human freedom. He had initially drafted the proclamation after the Union victory at Antietam, waiting for a Union victory to give it the necessary weight and prevent it from appearing as an act of desperation. Issued as a preliminary proclamation on September 22, 1862, it declared that if the Confederate States did not return to the Union by January 1, 1863, all enslaved people in those rebellious territories would be declared free. This momentous document fundamentally altered the nature and objectives of the Civil War. It did not immediately free all enslaved people, as it applied only to areas still in rebellion, but it signaled a profound shift in Union policy, effectively making the abolition of slavery a war aim. It also had significant international implications, effectively ending any realistic hope of British or French intervention on behalf of the Confederacy, as public opinion in those nations was largely against slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation ignited a firestorm of controversy. In the North, while celebrated by abolitionists and many Republicans, it also met with resistance from some who feared it would prolong the war or lead to racial upheaval. Democrats often used it as a rallying cry, portraying it as an unconstitutional overreach by Lincoln. In the South, it was met with outrage and condemnation, viewed as a barbaric attempt to incite slave insurrections and destroy their social order. However, its long-term impact was immense. It provided a powerful moral foundation for the Union cause, rallying new support and inspiring enslaved people to flee to Union lines, significantly disrupting the Confederate labor force. Perhaps most importantly, it opened the door for African Americans to serve in the Union Army. Initially, Black soldiers were limited to support roles, but soon, regiments like the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry began to see active combat, proving their valor and challenging deeply ingrained racial prejudices. Their participation added a powerful dimension to the Union effort, transforming the struggle into a fight for liberty and equality, forever altering the course of American history. The Emancipation Proclamation, born out of the crucible of Antietam, stands as one of the most pivotal documents in American history, irrevocably linking the fate of the Union to the cause of freedom for millions. The latter part of 1862 saw the Union struggle to maintain momentum in the East. Following Antietam, Lincoln again grew frustrated with McClellan's continued inaction and finally removed him from command in November, replacing him with General Ambrose Burnside. Burnside, a well-meaning but often outmatched commander, was under immense pressure to achieve a decisive victory. His ill-fated offensive across the Rappahannock River in December led to the Battle of Fredericksburg, a catastrophic Union defeat. launching repeated, suicidal frontal assaults against well-entrenched Confederate positions on Marais Heights. Burnside's army suffered horrific casualties, with thousands of Union soldiers mowed down by devastating Confederate artillery and rifle fire. The carnage was immense, and the Union Army was forced to retreat in disarray. Fredericksburg was a morale-crushing defeat for the North, further deepening the sense of despair and prolonging the agony of the war. It underscored the formidable defensive capabilities of the Confederate Army, particularly under Lee's command, and demonstrated the devastating consequences of frontal assaults against fortified positions. As 1862 drew to a close, the Union had achieved a strategic victory in repelling Lee's invasion and issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. But the military landscape in the East remained grim, overshadowed by the memory of Antietam's bloodshed and the crushing defeat at Fredericksburg. The promise of freedom was now intertwined with the harsh realities of a war that continued to demand an agonizingly high price in human lives. As 1863 dawned, the United States found itself mired in a brutal, protracted conflict with no clear end in sight. The initial optimism of a swift victory had long evaporated, replaced by a grim determination on both sides and a pervasive weariness throughout the nation. The Emancipation Proclamation, which officially went into effect on January 1, 1863, had fundamentally transformed the nature of the war, though its immediate military impact was still unfolding. For the Union, the disastrous defeat at Fredericksburg had plunged morale to a new low, leading to another change in command. President Lincoln, perpetually searching for a general who could match Lee's audacity, replaced Burnside with Major General Joseph Hooker, a man known for his flamboyant personality and his efforts to improve the morale and organization of the Army of the Potomac. Hooker, nicknamed Fighting Joe, initially instilled a renewed sense of confidence within the ranks. He meticulously reorganized the Army, improved camp conditions, and boosted soldier welfare, significantly reducing desertion rates. He boasted of having the finest army on the planet, and for a time, it seemed as though the Union might finally gain the upper hand in the East. However, Hooker's hubris would prove to be his undoing at the Battle of Chancellorsville in May 1863. Hooker devised a complex, seemingly brilliant plan to outflank Lee's army near Fredericksburg. His strategy initially achieved surprise, but Lee, with his characteristic boldness and a masterful understanding of his opponent, once again defied conventional military wisdom. Despite being outnumbered almost 2-1, Lee divided his army, a risky maneuver that paid off spectacularly. While a small force remained to confront Hooker's main body, General Stonewall Jackson led a daring and perilous flanking march of over 10,000 men through dense wilderness, launching a devastating surprise attack on the unsuspecting Union right flank. The attack caused widespread panic and disarray in the Union lines. Though Jackson was tragically wounded by friendly fire later that evening, his audacious maneuver was a decisive blow. The battle continued for several more days, marked by fierce fighting in the tangled thickets of the wilderness. Ultimately, Hooker, after being temporarily incapacitated by a shell striking his headquarters, lost his nerve and ordered a retreat. Chancellorsville was a stunning tactical victory for Lee and the Confederacy, often considered his most brilliant, further cementing his legendary status. However, it came at an immense cost, the irreplaceable loss of Stonewall Jackson, who died of pneumonia 8 days later. Jackson's death was a crushing blow to the Confederacy, depriving Lee of his most trusted and aggressive subordinate, a loss that would be felt acutely in subsequent campaigns. Buoyed by the stunning victory at Chancellorsville, and convinced that the time was ripe for another decisive strike into Union territory, Lee once again decided to invade the North. His objectives were similar to those of the Maryland campaign: to relieve pressure on Virginia, provision his army, demoralize the Northern public, and perhaps force the Lincoln administration to sue for peace or gain international recognition for the Confederacy. This invasion led to the most famous and pivotal battle of the entire war, Gettysburg. The two massive armies stumbled into each other almost by accident near the small Pennsylvania town of Gettysburg in early July. The battle began on July 1st, as Confederate forces pushing east encountered Union cavalry on McPherson's Ridge. What started as a skirmish quickly escalated into a full-scale engagement as both sides rushed reinforcements to the scene. The first day saw significant Confederate success, pushing the Union forces back through Gettysburg and onto a line of defensive high ground stretching from Culp's Hill to Cemetery Ridge and Little Round Top. This high ground proved to be crucial. The second day, July 2nd, was the bloodiest of the 3-day battle, marked by savage fighting for control of the key terrain features. Union forces, now under the command of Major General George G. Meade, who had replaced Hooker just days before the battle, desperately clung to their defensive positions. Confederate assaults crashed against the Union flanks, leading to iconic and brutal struggles in places like Devil's Den, the Wheat Field, the Peach Orchard, and most famously, Little Round Top. The fighting for Little Round Top, in particular, was desperate, with Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and his 20th Maine Regiment famously holding their ground against repeated Confederate assaults, culminating in a desperate bayonet charge that repelled the enemy and secured the Union left flank. Despite heavy losses, the Union line held, denying Lee the decisive breakthrough he desperately sought. The climax of the battle came on July 3rd with Pickett's charge, a massive frontal assault by some 12,500 Confederate infantrymen across open fields towards the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. Lee, confident in the fighting prowess of his veterans and believing the Union center had been weakened by artillery bombardment, ordered this desperate gamble. The charge was a heroic but ultimately suicidal endeavor. Union artillery and rifle fire decimated the Confederate ranks as they marched across the open ground. Very few Confederates reached the Union lines, and those who did were quickly overwhelmed. The charge was repulsed with catastrophic losses for the Confederacy, effectively ending Lee's offensive capabilities in the battle. The scale of the defeat was staggering, with the Army of Northern Virginia suffering over 28,000 casualties, a third of its strength, including many irreplaceable veteran officers and soldiers. Gettysburg was a decisive Union victory, turning the tide of the war in the East. Lay's army was severely crippled and would never again launch a major offensive into Union territory. The high water mark of the Confederacy had been reached and broken. While Gettysburg raged in Pennsylvania, another equally critical event was unfolding in the West, the Siege of Vicksburg. Vicksburg, Mississippi, a fortified city perched on high bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River, was a vital Confederate stronghold, controlling a crucial stretch of the river and effectively splitting the Union in two. Its capture was a strategic imperative for the Union, and Ulysses S. Grant, after a series of innovative and audacious maneuvers, had finally laid siege to the city. For weeks, Grant's forces systematically battered Vicksburg with artillery fire, while the civilian population and Confederate defenders endured starvation and constant bombardment. On July 4, 1863, the very day after Pickett's charge failed at Gettysburg, Vicksburg surrendered to Grant. The fall of Vicksburg was a monumental Union victory, effectively giving the Union complete control of the Mississippi River, splitting the Confederacy in two, and severing its vital supply lines from the West. Coupled with Gettysburg, Vicksburg represented a turning point in the war. These two simultaneous victories, one in the East and one in the West, dramatically shifted the momentum in favor of the Union, dispelling the aura of Confederate invincibility and setting the stage for the final, brutal years of the conflict. The summer of 1863, therefore, stands as a pivotal period, transforming the Union's prospects from grim stagnation to a renewed sense of purpose, and the dawning realization that victory, though still far off, was finally within reach. The twin victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg in July 1863 fundamentally altered the trajectory of the Civil War, injecting a renewed sense of purpose and determination into the Union cause, while simultaneously dimming the hopes of Confederate independence. For the first time, the North could truly envision victory, no longer a distant dream but a tangible goal, albeit one still requiring immense sacrifice. The strategic picture had shifted dramatically. The Confederacy was now split in two by Union control of the Mississippi River, and Lay's formidable army of Northern Virginia, though still dangerous, had been severely crippled and would largely remain on the defensive. President Lincoln, recognizing the immense contributions of Ulysses S. Grant in the West, now increasingly viewed him as the general who could deliver the ultimate victory. Grant's relentless pursuit of objectives, his willingness to fight, and his ability to see the larger strategic picture stood in stark contrast to the caution and indecision that had plagued many of his Eastern predecessors. While the attention of the nation remained largely focused on the Eastern theater, particularly on the aftermath of Gettysburg, significant movements were also occurring in the Western theater. Following the Vicksburg campaign, Grant set his sights on Chattanooga, Tennessee, a vital railroad hub and gateway to the Deep South. The campaign for Chattanooga was arduous, marked by fierce fighting in the mountainous terrain. In September, the Union Army of the Cumberland, under General William Rosecrans, suffered a costly defeat at the Battle of Chickamauga, a bloody engagement that saw the Union forces narrowly avoid a complete rout thanks to the desperate stand of General George H. Thomas, earning him the moniker the Rock of Chickamauga. The Union forces were forced to retreat into Chattanooga, where they were besieged by Confederate forces under General Braxton Bragg, perched on the heights overlooking the city. The situation for the trapped Union Army was dire, facing starvation and dwindling supplies. It was at this critical juncture that Lincoln appointed Grant to command all Union armies in the West, giving him the authority to break the siege. Grant quickly arrived in Chattanooga, bringing with him reinforcements, including troops under the command of William Tecumseh Sherman. In November 1863, Grant launched a series of daring and highly successful assaults that broke the Confederate siege of Chattanooga. The battles of Lookout Mountain, fought in a heavy fog and leading to the evocative Battle Above the Clouds, and Missionary Ridge were stunning Union victories. At Missionary Ridge, Union soldiers, without orders, spontaneously charged up the steep, seemingly impregnable slopes, breaking the Confederate lines and sending Bragg's army into a headlong retreat. The victories at Chattanooga secured the city for the Union, opened the way for Sherman's future campaigns into Georgia, and further solidified Grant's reputation as a decisive and victorious commander. These successes in the West provided a much-needed counterbalance to the lingering frustrations in the East, demonstrating that the Union had capable generals and could achieve decisive results when given the right leadership. Beyond the battlefields, the human toll of the war continued to mount, profoundly impacting both the soldiers and the civilians. The sheer scale of casualties, often exceeding anything seen in previous wars, strained medical systems to their breaking point. Medical knowledge was rudimentary, and infections, disease, and crude surgical procedures claimed far more lives than enemy bullets. The suffering in military hospitals, often overcrowded and unsanitary, was immense. On the home front, women played an increasingly vital role, taking on responsibilities traditionally held by men, working in factories, farms, and hospitals, and forming aid societies to support the soldiers. Their efforts were crucial to sustaining the war effort, both North and South, and the war became a catalyst for significant social changes, particularly for women, who demonstrated their capacity for leadership and organization in unprecedented ways. The economy of the South, dependent on slave labor and agricultural exports, was increasingly devastated by the Union blockade and the destruction wrought by advancing Union armies. Food shortages, inflation, and social unrest became widespread, eroding civilian morale and undermining the Confederate war effort from within. In the North, while the economy generally fared better, the war still demanded immense sacrifices, leading to protests against conscription and the financial burdens of the conflict. The political landscape in both the Union and the Confederacy also reflected the increasing strain of the war. In the North, Lincoln faced persistent criticism from Copperhead Democrats who advocated for a negotiated peace, and from abolitionists who believed he was not moving quickly enough to dismantle slavery. His leadership, however, proved to be remarkably resilient and adaptable, as he skillfully navigated the complex political currents, balancing military necessity with constitutional principles. In November 1863, Lincoln delivered his iconic Gettysburg Address a mere few months after the battle at the dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery. In just 272 words, Lincoln redefined the purpose of the war, moving beyond simply preserving the Union to embracing the new birth of freedom for which the soldiers had died, echoing the ideals of equality enshrined in the Declaration of Independence. The address, initially met with mixed reactions, has since become one of the most revered speeches in American history, encapsulating the profound moral stakes of the conflict and the enduring promise of American democracy. In the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis faced growing dissent and challenges to his authority, as states' rights advocates often undermined his central government's efforts to mobilize resources effectively. The Confederacy's decentralized nature, a foundational principle, ironically hindered its ability to wage a total war, leading to internecine squabbles and a lack of unified action that ultimately contributed to it. As 1863 drew to a close, the war had entered a new, grim phase. The Union, with Grant's ascendancy and the strategic breakthroughs at Gettysburg, Vicksburg, and Chattanooga, held the initiative. The Confederacy, though still capable of fierce resistance, was increasingly on the defensive, its resources dwindling, its population weary, and its hopes for foreign intervention all but extinguished. The next year would see the appointment of Grant to overall command of the Union armies and the implementation of a coordinated, relentless strategy of total war, signaling the beginning of the end for the Confederate cause, but also promising an even bloodier and more destructive period of conflict as the Union sought to crush the remaining pockets of resistance. The human cost, already immense, was destined to rise further, etching the sacrifices of a generation into the very fabric of the nation. The year 1864 opened with a clear strategic vision for the Union, a vision forged by Abraham Lincoln's unwavering determination and the ascendancy of Ulysses S. Grant. Lincoln, finally having found a general who shared his strategic mindset and relentless drive, promoted Grant to lieutenant general in March 1864, placing him in command of all Union armies. This was a pivotal moment, marking a significant shift from the previous, often uncoordinated, approach to warfare. Grant, in turn, appointed William Tecumseh Sherman to command the Western armies, cementing a dynamic partnership that would prove instrumental in achieving ultimate Union victory. The new strategy was simple yet brutal: simultaneous, coordinated offensives on all fronts, aimed at relentlessly wearing down the Confederacy's will and capacity to fight. No longer would the Union armies operate in isolation, allowing the Confederates to shift troops from one theater to another. The goal was to apply constant pressure, destroying not just enemy armies but also their economic and logistical infrastructure, a precursor to the concept of total war. Grant, choosing to directly confront Robert E. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia, established his headquarters with the Army of the Potomac, effectively becoming its operational commander while Meade retained nominal command. This meant Grant would face Lee in the east, a direct clash of titans that the North had long awaited. The ensuing campaign, often referred to as the Overland Campaign, began in May 1864 and was unlike anything seen before. Instead of maneuvering for position and then retreating after a battle, Grant adopted a strategy of continuous pressure. The fighting began in the dense, tangled thickets of the wilderness, the same forbidding terrain that had swallowed up Hooker's army a year earlier. The Battle of the Wilderness was a brutal, chaotic, and largely indecisive engagement, fought in an almost impenetrable forest where visibility was low, and troops often fought blind, relying on sound and instinct. The woods caught fire, adding another horrifying dimension to the conflict as wounded soldiers burned alive. Despite immense casualties, Grant, unlike his predecessors, did not retreat. Instead, he ordered his army to move by the left flank, attempting to outmaneuver Lee and continue southward. This marked the beginning of a grim pattern, a series of continuous, grinding battles that stretched through May and June 1864. From the wilderness, the armies clashed again at Spotsylvania Courthouse, where some of the most savage hand-to-hand fighting of the war occurred, particularly at the Bloody Angle, a salient in the Confederate lines that became a scene of unimaginable carnage. The fighting was relentless, characterized by heavy casualties on both sides, as Grant continued his southward movement, constantly pressing Lee. Grant's strategy was one of attrition. He understood that while his army suffered immense losses, the Union could replace its men and resources, whereas the Confederacy, with its dwindling manpower and economic base, could not. He famously declared, "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer." The next major engagement was at Cold Harbor, a catastrophic Union frontal assault against heavily entrenched Confederate positions. In less than an hour, thousands of Union soldiers were mowed down, a testament to the deadly efficiency of defensive warfare in the age of the rifled musket. Cold Harbor remains one of the most lopsided and tragic Union defeats of the war, further highlighting the grim cost of Grant's relentless strategy. Despite the horrific casualties suffered in these battles, losses that earned Grant the grim moniker, the Butcher, in some northern newspapers, the strategic impact was undeniable. Lee's army, though fighting valiantly and inflicting heavy damage, was constantly being pushed back, its ranks thinning, its defensive perimeter shrinking. Grant's unrelenting pressure meant Lee could no longer shift forces to other theaters. He was inextricably tied to defending Richmond and Petersburg. The campaigns culminated in the Siege of Petersburg, a vital railroad hub south of Richmond. After failed attempts to capture the city by direct assault, Grant settled into a protracted siege that would last for nearly 10 months. Petersburg became a microcosm of the grinding nature of the war, characterized by elaborate trench lines, earthworks, and a brutal existence for soldiers on both sides. The siege also saw innovative tactics, such as the Battle of the Crater, where Union miners dug a tunnel under Confederate lines and detonated explosives, only for the ensuing assault to turn into a bloody fiasco due to poor planning and execution. While Grant was locking horns with Lee in Virginia, William Tecumseh Sherman was executing his part of the grand strategy in the West. His objective was Atlanta, Georgia, another critical railroad hub and industrial center for the Confederacy. Sherman's campaign, which began in May 1864, was characterized by brilliant maneuvering and relentless pressure. He systematically outflanked Confederate forces under General Joseph E. Johnston, forcing them to repeatedly retreat rather than engage in decisive battle. Sherman's march to the sea was not just a military campaign, but also a psychological one. He employed a strategy of devastating the Confederate infrastructure, destroying railroads, factories, and anything that could support the Confederate war effort. His famous quote, "War is hell," encapsulates his belief that to end the war quickly, it had to be made as terrible as possible for the civilian population that supported the Confederacy. The capture of Atlanta in September 1864 was a monumental Union victory, both militarily and psychologically. It provided a much-needed boost to Northern morale, especially in the midst of the ongoing presidential election. Lincoln's re-election prospects, which had looked bleak due to war weariness and the heavy casualties of Grant's campaigns, were significantly bolstered by Sherman's success. The fall of Atlanta convinced many in the North that victory was indeed within reach, and that Lincoln's resolute leadership was finally yielding decisive results. The combined pressure of Grant's siege of Petersburg and Sherman's capture of Atlanta demonstrated the effectiveness of the coordinated Union strategy. The Confederacy was being squeezed from multiple directions, its ability to resupply and reinforce its armies severely hampered. The grim reality of attrition warfare, the relentless pressure applied by Grant and Sherman, was slowly but inexorably strangling the life out of the Confederacy, setting the stage for the final, devastating acts of the war. The immense human cost of these campaigns, the suffering of the soldiers, and the growing despair on the Southern home front are powerfully conveyed, underscoring the profound sacrifices demanded by the final push for Union victory. With the fall of Atlanta in September 1864 and Grant's tenacious siege of Petersburg, the strategic momentum had definitively shifted in favor of the Union. The Confederacy, its resources dwindling and its manpower exhausted, found itself on the defensive on all fronts, clinging precariously to the hope that Northern war weariness might yet force a negotiated peace. This hope, however, was shattered by the political developments in the North. The Union victories, particularly Sherman's capture of Atlanta, played a critical role in the 1864 presidential election. For much of the year, Abraham Lincoln's re-election prospects looked grim. Public fatigue with the war, the staggering casualty lists from Grant's overland campaign, and the lingering frustration over the seemingly endless conflict had fueled significant anti-war sentiment. The Democratic Party, with former General George B. McClellan as their candidate, ran on a platform that implicitly called for a negotiated end to the war, a stance that resonated with many war-weary Northerners. Lincoln, recognizing the precariousness of his position, felt he might not win. However, Sherman's triumph in Atlanta, coupled with victories in the Shenandoah Valley by General Philip Sheridan against Confederate forces under Jubal Early, provided a crucial boost to Union morale and demonstrated that the war was, indeed, winnable under Lincoln's leadership. The public, seeing tangible progress, rallied behind the president, and Lincoln won re-election decisively in November 1864, securing a strong mandate to continue the war until unconditional surrender. This victory was a devastating blow to the Confederacy, extinguishing any realistic hope of a negotiated peace and signaling that the North would not falter in its resolve. Following the capture of Atlanta, William Tecumseh Sherman embarked on his controversial but strategically brilliant march to the sea. In November 1864, having cut his supply lines and effectively operating independently, Sherman led 60,000 Union soldiers on a destructive march across Georgia, from Atlanta to Savannah. His objective was not primarily to engage and destroy Confederate armies, but rather to break the will of the Southern people to resist. Sherman believed that by bringing the full horrors of war directly to the civilian population, he could accelerate the end of the conflict. His army operated on the principle of total war, foraging for supplies, destroying railroads, factories, public buildings, and anything that could aid the Confederate war effort. While there were instances of widespread destruction and pillaging, Sherman largely maintained discipline, focusing on military targets and infrastructure. The march devastated a wide swath of Georgia, leaving a trail of destruction 60 miles wide. It was a psychological blow of immense proportions to the Confederacy, demonstrating its inability to protect its own territory and exposing the vulnerability of its heartland. The march was deeply controversial, then as now, raising questions about the ethics of targeting civilian resources, but its effectiveness in demoralizing the South was undeniable. Meanwhile, Grant's siege of Petersburg continued, grinding on through the winter of 1864-1865. The trench warfare was brutal, characterized by constant skirmishing, artillery duels, and the harsh realities of winter encampment. Life in the trenches was a constant struggle against disease, boredom, and the ever-present threat of enemy fire. Soldiers on both sides endured freezing temperatures, inadequate food, and the psychological toll of prolonged confinement. The stalemate at Petersburg highlighted the strength of Lee's defensive lines, but also the relentless pressure Grant was applying. Lee, with his dwindling forces, was trapped, unable to maneuver or break free. The Confederacy was slowly starving, its lines of supply increasingly tenuous, and its civilian population suffering from severe shortages and rampant inflation. Desertion rates in the Confederate Army escalated as soldiers, often aware of the suffering of their families on the home front, abandoned their posts. the social fabric of the South was unraveling under the immense strain of the war. As 1865 began, the end of the war seemed within sight. Sherman, having captured Savannah in December 1864, turned his army northward, embarking on an equally destructive march through the Carolinas. This march was arguably even more brutal than the one through Georgia, as Union soldiers harbored particular resentment towards South Carolina, the state where secession had begun. Columbia, the capital of South Carolina, was largely destroyed by fire, though the precise cause remains a subject of historical debate. The Union forces continued their relentless advance, leaving a path of desolation and effectively eliminating the Confederacy's last remaining industrial centers and supply lines. The Confederacy was now being crushed between Sherman's advancing army from the south and Grant's unrelenting pressure from the north. The final act of the war was unfolding in Virginia. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, severely weakened by casualties, desertion, and attrition, was desperately trying to hold its lines at Petersburg. Knowing that his position was untenable and that his army faced starvation and annihilation if they remained besieged, Lee made a desperate attempt to break out of Petersburg in early April 1865. His gamble failed. Union forces, now overwhelming in numbers and supplies, launched a decisive offensive that broke through the Confederate lines. Lee was forced to abandon Petersburg and Richmond, the Confederate capital, which fell to Union forces on April 3, 1865. The sight of Union soldiers marching through the streets of Richmond, the symbol of the Confederacy, and the burning of parts of the city by retreating Confederates marked a profound turning point. The end was clearly at hand. The Confederacy's grand experiment in independent nationhood was collapsing under the weight of Union military might and its own internal weaknesses. The journey from initial secession to this final desperate stand had been long and bloody, a testament to the immense human cost of division and the ultimate triumph of union and freedom. The final days of the war, though marked by Union triumph, were also imbued with a poignant sense of exhaustion and the grim realization of the immense task of reconciliation and rebuilding that lay ahead for a fractured nation. The fall of Richmond and Petersburg in early April 1865 signaled the conclusive end of the Confederacy's struggle for independence. But the final days of the war, though brief, were still fraught with tension, desperation, and poignant surrender. Robert E. Lee, his once formidable army of Northern Virginia now a shadow of its former self, began a desperate retreat westward, hoping to link up with the remnants of Confederate forces under General Joseph E. Johnston in North Carolina. His objective was to prolong the conflict, perhaps to secure more favorable terms or simply to avoid the humiliation of immediate surrender. However, Ulysses S. Grant, sensing the imminent collapse of Lee's army, launched a relentless pursuit. The Union forces, now better supplied, better fed, and buoyed by the knowledge of impending victory, harried Lee's exhausted and starving soldiers without mercy. The chase was relentless, a stark contrast to the prolonged sieges and static trench warfare that had characterized the previous months. Lee's retreat was a harrowing ordeal for his soldiers. They were starving, many had no shoes, and their morale was shattered. They had fought valiantly for 4 long years, but the sheer weight of Union numbers and relentless pursuit proved insurmountable. Skirmishes erupted along the line of march, with the Union cavalry, under the command of General Philip Sheridan, particularly effective in cutting off escape routes and destroying Confederate supply trains. The grim reality of their situation became increasingly clear to Lee and his senior officers. Their options were dwindling rapidly. Attempts to secure provisions failed, and their escape routes were continually blocked by swift Union movements. The psychological toll on the Confederate soldiers who had endured so much was immense as they realized the futility of continued resistance. The chase culminated on April 9, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse, a small village in central Virginia. Lee, realizing his army was surrounded and that further fighting would only result in needless slaughter, made the agonizing decision to surrender. He sent a message to Grant, requesting a meeting to discuss terms. The meeting between the two great generals who had represented the very heart of the conflict for the past year was remarkably dignified and understated. It took place in the McLean House, a simple farmhouse in Appomattox. Grant, known for his generosity in victory, offered magnanimous terms of surrender. Confederate soldiers were permitted to stack their arms and return home after pledging not to take up arms against the United States again. Officers were allowed to keep their sidearms, and most importantly, all Confederate soldiers who owned horses or mules were allowed to keep them for the spring planting. A gesture of remarkable foresight and compassion that acknowledged the immediate needs of the soldiers and the pressing need for agricultural recovery in the devastated South. Grant also ordered that rations be distributed to the starving Confederate army. The surrender at Appomattox was a moment of profound relief for a war-weary nation, but it was also tinged with deep emotion and the lingering weight of immense loss. The scene of the surrender, with Confederate soldiers quietly stacking their weapons, and Union soldiers, many of whom had fought against these men for years, often offering food and respects, highlighted the unique nature of this civil conflict. It was a moment of reconciliation, a fragile beginning to the long and arduous process of healing a fractured nation. News of Lee's surrender quickly spread throughout the Union, igniting widespread celebrations. Bells rang, bonfires were lit, and people poured into the streets, overjoyed that the long nightmare of war was finally over. The jubilant celebrations, however, were tragically short-lived. Just 5 days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox, on April 14, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Lincoln, who had guided the nation through its darkest hour with remarkable wisdom, compassion, and moral clarity, died the following morning. His assassination plunged the nation into profound grief and shock. The immediate aftermath was one of immense sorrow and outrage, particularly in the North. Lincoln's death was a crushing blow, not only for his family and personal friends, but for a nation that had just begun to breathe a sigh of relief. It cast a long shadow over the Union victory, complicating the already difficult task of reconstruction and reconciliation. The assassination was part of a larger conspiracy targeting other high-ranking government officials, including Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William Seward, though those attempts failed. Booth, a popular actor and ardent Confederate sympathizer, believed he was striking a blow for the Southern cause, but his act of violence ultimately robbed the nation of its most experienced and empathetic leader at the precise moment he was most needed to guide the country through the immense challenges of rebuilding and bringing the fractured states back into the Union. Lincoln's vision for Reconstruction, articulated in his second inaugural address with the powerful words "with malice toward none, with charity for all," was a plea for a generous and forgiving peace aimed at binding the nation's wounds. His death left a void in leadership and unleashed a period of intense political struggle over the future of the South and the rights of newly freed enslaved people. The legacy of his assassination underscored the deep divisions that still simmered beneath the surface, even after the fighting had ceased. The end of the war and Lincoln's tragic death marked the close of one of the most tumultuous chapters in American history, giving way to the complex and often painful era of Reconstruction, where the true meaning of freedom and equality would be fiercely debated and fought for, but without the steady hand of the leader who had so skillfully navigated the storm of war. The profound sense of both relief and tragedy that pervaded the spring of 1865 remains a powerful and enduring image of a nation grappling with the immense cost and the transformative impact of its most defining conflict. The period immediately following Lee's surrender at Appomattox and Lincoln's assassination was one of profound upheaval and uncertainty, ushering in the complex and often tumultuous era known as Reconstruction. With the war definitively over, the jubilant celebrations in the North quickly gave way to a stark realization of the immense challenges ahead. The South, devastated by years of warfare and the destructive campaigns of Sherman and Sheridan, lay in ruins. Its economy, built on the institution of slavery, was shattered, and its social order was in chaos. Millions of newly freed African Americans or freedmen found themselves liberated but without land, resources, or legal protection, facing a hostile white population determined to maintain racial hierarchies. In the North, the question of how to reintegrate the Southern states, punish the rebellious leadership, and define the rights of the freedmen became the central political dilemma, unleashing fierce debates that would shape American society for decades. President Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor, a Tennessee Unionist who harbored deep prejudices against African Americans, pursued a lenient policy towards the defeated Southern states. His approach, which quickly granted pardons to many former Confederates and allowed the rapid re-establishment of white-dominated governments, clashed sharply with the views of the radical Republicans in Congress. These Republicans, driven by a strong moral conviction that the South needed to be fundamentally reformed, and that African Americans deserved full citizenship rights, believed Johnson's policies were too lenient and would betray the sacrifices made during the war. The clash between Johnson and Congress quickly escalated into a bitter political struggle, fundamentally shaping the course of Reconstruction. Congress, asserting its authority, passed a series of landmark legislative acts aimed at protecting the rights of freedmen and reorganizing the Southern states. These included the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which aimed to grant equal rights and citizenship to African Americans, and the Reconstruction Acts of 1867, which divided the South into military districts, disenfranchised many former Confederates, and required Southern states to ratify the 14th Amendment and grant Black men the right to vote before rejoining the Union. The 13th Amendment, ratified in December 1865, had officially abolished slavery throughout the United States, representing a monumental achievement and the fulfillment of one of the war's most profound outcomes. However, the legal and social reality for freedmen remained precarious. Southern states, under Johnson's lenient policies, quickly enacted black codes, discriminatory laws designed to control the labor and movement of African Americans, effectively re-establishing a system of quasi-slavery. This blatant attempt to circumvent the spirit of emancipation further inflamed Northern opinion and solidified the resolve of the radical Republicans. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, defined citizenship, guaranteed equal protection under the law, and prohibited states from infringing upon the rights of their citizens, fundamentally altering the relationship between the federal government and individual states, and laying the groundwork for future civil rights struggles. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, explicitly granted African American men the right to vote, a revolutionary concept at the time and a testament to the transformative power of the war and the radicalism of the Reconstruction era. During this period, African Americans, often with the support of the Freedmen's Bureau, a federal agency established to aid former enslaved people and poor whites in the South, began to exercise their newfound rights and build their communities. They established schools, churches, and political organizations, and for the first time, Black men actively participated in the political process, voting and holding office at local, state, and even federal levels. This period, sometimes referred to as Radical Reconstruction, saw significant advancements in civil rights and political participation for African Americans, a brief but powerful experiment in biracial democracy in the South. However, these gains were met with fierce and often violent resistance from white Southerners, who resented federal intervention, Black political participation, and the perceived humiliation of defeat. Secret organizations like the Ku Klux Klan emerged, employing terror, intimidation, and violence to suppress Black voting and reassert white supremacy. The federal government, under President Grant's administration, attempted to suppress this violence with the Enforcement Acts, but the scale of the resistance was immense, and federal resources were stretched thin. The economic reality for freedmen was equally challenging. The promise of 40 acres and a mule, though never fully realized as a widespread policy, reflected the hope that former enslaved people would receive land to achieve economic independence. Instead, many were forced into sharecropping or tenant farming, systems that often kept them in a cycle of debt and dependency, effectively maintaining their economic subservience to white landowners. The Southern economy, in its struggle to rebuild without slave labor, faced immense difficulties and stagnation for decades. The social and political landscape of the South remained deeply fractured, characterized by ongoing racial violence, political instability, and the struggle between those who sought to establish a new, more equitable society and those who desperately clung to the old order. The end of Reconstruction, often marked by the Compromise of 1877, saw the withdrawal of federal troops from the South in exchange for Rutherford B. Hayes's disputed presidential election victory. This effectively ended federal protection for African Americans' civil and political rights, paving the way for the systematic disenfranchisement of Black voters and the imposition of Jim Crow laws, which established legal segregation and cemented white supremacy for nearly a century. The hopes for a truly egalitarian society that had blossomed in the immediate aftermath of the war were largely dashed, leading to a long and painful period of racial oppression and injustice in the South. The legacy of Reconstruction, therefore, is complex and often contradictory. A period of extraordinary promise and significant achievement in the advancement of civil rights, but also one of ultimate failure in fully securing those rights against determined white resistance. The battles fought during Reconstruction, though often political and social rather than military, were as crucial to defining the future of the nation as any battle on the Civil War battlefields, and their reverberations continue to echo in American society to this day. As Reconstruction faded, giving way to an era of renewed racial subjugation in the South, the profound and enduring legacy of the Civil War began to crystallize in the national consciousness. The conflict, having claimed more than 620,000 American lives, a staggering figure that eclipses the combined casualties of all other U.S. wars until Vietnam, left an indelible mark on every facet of American society. The war forever redefined the nature of the American Union, definitively settling the long-standing debate over states' rights versus federal authority. Prior to the war, the idea of states voluntarily leaving the Union was a plausible, if contentious, concept. After the war, secession was unequivocally established as unconstitutional and impossible. The United States was no longer a collection of loosely affiliated sovereign states, but a single indivisible nation, a reality forged in blood and fire. The federal government emerged from the conflict significantly strengthened, with expanded powers and a greater role in national life, setting the stage for its increasing influence throughout the 20th century. Beyond the political and constitutional transformations, the Civil War was a catalyst for profound social and economic change. The abolition of slavery, enshrined in the 13th Amendment, represented the most radical and fundamental shift in American society since its founding. 4 million enslaved people were freed, ending centuries of institutionalized human bondage and fundamentally altering the economic landscape of the South. While the promise of full equality remained elusive for decades, the war undeniably set in motion the long and arduous struggle for civil rights, laying the groundwork for future movements that would eventually challenge segregation and discrimination. The South's agrarian economy, once reliant on slave labor, was forced to adapt, albeit slowly and painfully, to new systems of labor, often leading to sharecropping and tenant farming that perpetuated economic dependency for many freedmen. The North, by contrast, saw its industrial might further accelerate during and after the war, with the demands of wartime production spurring innovation and growth, solidifying its position as an industrial powerhouse and paving the way for America's emergence as a global economic leader. The development of railroads, factories, and mass production techniques honed during the conflict became integral to the nation's post-war economic expansion. The memory of the Civil War, however, was not monolithic. In the decades that followed, competing narratives emerged, shaping how Americans understood their past. In the South, the lost cause narrative gained prominence, romanticizing the Confederacy, downplaying the role of slavery as the cause of the war, and portraying Confederate soldiers as noble defenders of their homeland against Northern aggression. This narrative served to soothe the wounds of defeat, justify racial segregation, and reinforce white supremacy. In the North, the war was largely remembered as a heroic struggle to preserve the Union and, increasingly, to abolish slavery. These divergent memories contributed to ongoing sectional tensions and made true reconciliation a long and difficult process. Monuments, memorials, and historical societies emerged on both sides, each telling their version of the story, shaping public perception and contributing to the complex legacy of the conflict. The war also left an enduring legacy on American identity. It forced the nation to grapple with its founding ideals of liberty and equality, exposing the hypocrisy of a nation that proclaimed freedom while upholding slavery. The struggle over these ideals, initiated by the war, continued throughout Reconstruction and the subsequent civil rights movement. The sacrifices made by soldiers on both sides, the immense suffering endured, and the ultimate preservation of the Union forged a new sense of national identity, albeit one still grappling with deep racial divisions. The valor and courage displayed by soldiers, black and white, North and South, became part of a shared national mythology, even as the causes they fought for remained deeply contentious. The Civil War transformed the American landscape, both literally and figuratively, leaving behind countless battlefields, cemeteries, and monuments that serve as solemn reminders of the conflict. It also left a rich archive of letters, diaries, photographs, and oral histories, providing invaluable insights into the human experience of war, allowing future generations to connect with the personal stories of those who lived through this transformative period. The legacy of the Civil War is therefore multifaceted and continues to evolve. It remains a subject of intense historical inquiry, public debate, and profound emotional resonance. It is a war that never truly ended in the minds of many, its echoes reverberating through subsequent struggles for civil rights, social justice, and political equality. It shaped the American landscape, its institutions, and its people in ways that are still being understood and debated today. Ken Burns's The Civil War eloquently captures this multifaceted legacy, presenting a nuanced and deeply human portrayal of a conflict that simultaneously tore the nation apart and ultimately forged it anew, imperfectly, but irrevocably. The documentary ensures that the stories of those who lived and died in this defining struggle continue to inform and challenge us, prompting a perpetual reflection on the meaning of liberty, justice, and nationhood in America. Ken Burns's The Civil War is far more than a historical account. It is a profound meditation on the nature of American identity, the enduring struggle for justice, and the devastating cost of division. Through its meticulous weaving of archival images, personal narratives, and expert commentary, the series brings to life the epic sweep and intimate tragedy of the conflict, allowing viewers to witness not just battles and political maneuvers, but the raw human experience of those who lived through it. The enduring impact of the series lies in its ability to humanize the immense statistics of the war, reminding us that behind every casualty figure was a life, a family, and a story. It compels us to confront the moral complexities of slavery, the immense sacrifices made for freedom and union, and the painful, often incomplete, process of reconciliation. The Civil War underscores that while the battles ended over 160 years ago, the themes of race, states' rights, and the very definition of American citizenship continue to resonate, shaping our present and influencing our future. It serves as a powerful reminder that history is not a distant, finished story, but a living, breathing narrative that continues to inform our understanding of ourselves as a nation, forever bound by the profound and transformative legacy of its greatest, most terrible war.